And we're very glad that Michael Brooks has taken some time out of a very busy schedule, as I know, to be with us this afternoon. Unfortunately, he can't stay the whole weekend because of various other commitments, but we're so glad that he's been able to come along and speak to us today. Michael has a PhD in quantum physics, so that's his background in science. He spent 4 years in freelance work for a number of major newspapers in this country, The Guardian, New Scientist, Independent Observer, was writing science articles for many different papers. And then since the year 2000 has been features editor at New Scientist, and he's had particular responsibility there for writing about physics and maths and also technology. And in 2004, which again I think is where we first met, Michael came here to Cambridge for the Templeton Fellowship for Journalists that we were hearing a bit about earlier on. In fact, he's just now recently become a consultant for New Scientist, and he's writing a book at the moment during this period called Things That Don't Make Sense, which is about anomalies in science, some of the great anomalies or things that we don't yet understand fully. And he's writing a book about that, so we look forward to that very much. And we also look forward to your talk, Michael. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much for inviting me here. It's a privilege to talk to you about this. I hope I'm going to provoke you somewhat this afternoon. I see the conversation's already been steered in the direction I was hoping to steer it in, which is great. So I've been asked to talk about science and religion from the perspective of a science journalist. And what I really want to do is to look here at issues about how science and religion are reported by science journalists as opposed to by any other kind of journalist. So I'm talking about the specialists really here. Just another kind of bit of background for this. I am a Christian. I'm a kind of church-going Christian. I have been since conversion experience around 13 years old. And I currently attend an evangelical church in my hometown, which I think poses its own special challenges for someone who knows about science, but also wants to just get on with being part of a faith community. So I kind of have an interest in this whole debate. So looking at science, religion, and science journalism, I really want to look at some of these questions. First, what is science journalism about? What are its prejudices? Where do they come from? And does science and religion have anything to offer a science journalist? I hope this is going to be a provocative and controversial talk. We'll see, won't we, from the discussion element. My talk is going to kind of be based around this graph, which is an entirely non-scientific graph. I'm glad you now know that I have a PhD in quantum physics, because that's where the science ends, really. This graph, let me explain what it is to you. I wanted to talk about the prejudices of a science journalist and where science journalism is coming from. And to do that, I kind of thought I would do a bit of sampling of the New Scientist archive. The New Scientist, for people who don't know it, is the world's biggest science and technology weekly, we like to shout. There aren't many around, to be honest, but we have a readership of about 165,000 people every week, so sort of, and that's a global reach. What I've done is go into our archive and try and think of a way to kind of look at our coverage of science and religion and the trends that might be within it. And so what I did was I put the word Pope into our search engine. And then, as if that wasn't unscientific enough, I then gave each of the 150 stories that came out over this period, which is, I think it actually started in '93 to the present day. I kind of read them through and thought about them and gave them a score in terms of their antagonism or not towards the subject matter of science and religion, or just religion, in fact. Everything in New Scientist is about science, or it's supposed to be about science. As we'll see, it isn't always about science, if there's a point to be made. And so I gave them a score, and then plotted this graph, which, as you can see, anyone could draw a straight line through. And what I want to show you really is that there is an issue with reporting of science and religion. I think New Scientist is probably the only place where you
Mike,
only...
I can't read the axes.
Oh, sorry. This axis here is antagonism towards religion.
Ah, and going up.
Date.
Yeah.
Yes, and
Okay.
it's going up. So this is highly antagonistic, and this is actually quite positive, so
Okay.
a negative value, as it were. What I want to do is kind of show that there is an issue that we can discuss later. That actually things have changed, is my point. And we can look at why things maybe have changed. And you can reject all of this data if you want to, but it's a useful basis for discussion. I'm not, I wouldn't die for it. But I think it is actually, it does reflect what I kind of expected to find on this score. It's very difficult to do this with another publication, because New Scientist only covers science, as I've said. If you do that with a search engine for any other newspaper or magazine, you'll get a huge spectrum of stories written by religion correspondents, written by political correspondents. New Scientist only has science journalists, so for me it was a good way of kind of narrowing this down. So this is the graph that I've got. I want to really show you some of we'll actually run through most of the stories on here, but I first of all want to give you a bit of a flavour of science journalists in my experience. Where are science journalists coming from? These are gross but hopefully useful generalisations. They have a science background. I think Martin said the same about the BBC Science Unit. Everyone at New Scientist, I think, has a science degree. There are a couple who don't. There's a couple who have a philosophy degree, but we only let them do the comment and analysis. You think I'm joking? I'm not. They are pro-science. This might be seen as a controversial statement, but I assure you it's absolutely true. They are pro-science. And this is something that maybe you don't really think about when you're reading a magazine or reading a piece of work by a science journalist. You will invariably find that this journalist, were you to talk to them, thinks science is a very good thing. Thinks science is the answer to most of the world's problems. Thinks that science is basically the way everyone should think about the world. It's a very, I hesitate to use the word, almost bigoted kind of worldview. If you're a science journalist, this is kind of how it is. And so, they really think that society would benefit from understanding more science. Otherwise, they'd be out of a job for a start. There's no point being a science journalist if you don't think that science is interesting and useful. You won't get very far. But the other very important thing about being a science journalist that you have to understand when you look at the stories that are reported and the stories that aren't reported is that science journalists need scientists on their side. And this is the point, really, that Pete was making earlier, that this is not political journalism. A political journalist, one hopes, believes in democracy, at least, and will look at politicians in the light of democracy being the thing to uphold, openness, understanding both sides of an argument, seeing who's being represented, who's being quashed, what opinions are coming out and what aren't. Science journalism doesn't work like that. One of the problems of science journalism is that we have limited access to our stories. In order to get access to our stories and to report them well, we need the scientists on side, and we need the scientists to be talking to us. If the scientists have a particularly interesting piece of work and they refuse to talk to us about it, there's very little reporting we can actually do. And we're having a debate at the moment within New Scientist related to this, which maybe I should or shouldn't talk about, but I will, is the issue of scientists more and more asking to approve the story once it's been written, before it's been published, as a condition of talking to the journalist. Now, if a politician tried to do this, they would be laughed out of, and it would probably be reported on the pages of the newspaper, in fact, that they'd asked for it. This is not the case with science journalism. It's actually a very difficult issue for us. Our house rule is that we don't offer copy approval before publication. We just can't do it. It's not good journalism. But actually, increasingly, scientists are trying it on and asking that they get to approve the copy so they can check the facts and check that they're being quoted accurately, by which they mean favourably. And this is something that science journalism has to cope with, because you can't do a science story if you can't talk to the scientists involved. What we take is a paper. We usually need, although we're pretty well qualified, we do need explanation, we need further clarifications. when you take a scientific paper and try and report what it's saying, you need to be able to go back to the source and say, what did you really mean when you wrote this? If you can't do that, it's very difficult to produce a good science story. So we have to try our hardest to keep scientists on side, which isn't actually a big problem because we like scientists, as I said. Here I think is the key ingredient which Martin touched on as well. Religion does not play an important part in the worldview of the science journalist. That is an almost universal rule. I would say I'm the only person with an active, explicit faith in New Scientist. It's not been the subject of derision at all, but nobody has the same worldview as me. And so it's very important when you're considering issues of science and religion in the science journalist context. Religion is not part of the worldview, and so it's coming in from outside, and it better kind of play by the right rules. Okay. Another kind of basics. Why does a science journalist report on something? Well, hopefully it's news. It has a who, somebody did something somewhere because of something, and the when usually should be this week, often isn't. It's got to be important and interesting. It's got to be worth it. Interesting and bizarre is very important. You've got to realise that New Scientist and the newspapers in general are not interested in educating you. I know we talked about this earlier. New Scientist is classed as a leisure read. People read it because they want to in their leisure time. And so it had better be entertaining, and it had better be fun to read, and you better be glad you read it. It's informative, yes, but it's actually meant to be entertaining as well. So the criteria for actually responsible reporting, as it were, has to be judged by that criteria, I would say. That it's not just there to tell the truth. And for New Scientists, certainly, and for most science journalists, it has to be a science-related story. Although, if it serves our purposes, you'll see in an example, that's not always true. Okay, so this was the first piece of data I got when I did my search. In another effort to improve relations between the Catholic Church and science, the Pope acknowledged the work of Copernicus, one of the greatest scientific achievements of all time. Actually, I scored that quite highly. That's kind of approving, effectively. You may disagree with any of my analyses on this as we go through them, but I think that's kind of quite positive. It's sort of saying, this religious person is actually kind of, approving science. And we like people who approve science when we're science journalists. I'm going to run through these fairly quickly. Here's one just the following week or 2 weeks later. The Pope praises Copernicus for having the courage of a scientist to go public with his ideas. Particularly appealing statement to a science-loving science journalist there, the courage of a scientist, as if scientists are somehow, universally sort of superheroes. So the Pope scored well for us with that one, I would say. The tenor of the Pope's message is that of an apologia. He seems to be trying to make amends with science. Now, again, I think this is a very positive story, but notice how it's, the Pope is being expected to do all the running. This is about science being right and the Pope just catching up. This is from a book review in '94. I'm actually going to run through all the data points because I don't want you to think I've excluded any. But this just talks about Pope John Paul in the context of science and religion. It's about keeping them in proper places. Talks about Pope John Paul as separating science and faith. Good fences make good neighbours. It's generally quite positive about the Pope's input on this subject. Leading Minds, this is another book review. This is about leadership. What makes leaders, what makes great leaders? And notice that we've got vision and skills to communicate. We've got Margaret Thatcher, we've got George Marshall, and we've got Pope John XIII here. So the Pope is being really seen as a prominent and important and positive figure, I would say.
So do you mean Pope John the 23rd?
Oh, was it the 23rd?
Yeah.
Sorry, I may have... Well, we probably made that mistake because I cut this from the okay, 96. We ran a feature about the Vatican Observatory here. intellectual treasures at the Vatican. Again, just a very positive kind of spin on science and religion and the interface between them. That's 96. Here we are, 97. This is talking about the cloning of Dolly the sheep. Leading statesmen struck moral poses, and presidents, ministers, and perhaps more reasonably the Pope. This is an explicit recommendation that somebody of faith can make ethical and moral judgments much better than politicians. It's explicit, but actually you wouldn't notice it unless you were looking for that. But it's a very positively written piece. This is saying that people of faith have more ability to comment on issues of bioethics than presidents and ministers, which is, again, very positive outcome, I would say. Okay, now we're in 2000. Interesting gap there. The Pope is interested in science. He was a university professor and he just likes to know what's going on. This is taken out of an interview with the director of the Vatican Observatory. And he never intervenes in the running of the observatory. So this is a Pope who has respect for science, again, a very positive kind of view. Now we're just about to see things shift. This is the year 2000. And we can discuss the reasons for the shift. But it's interesting that it's around the time of stem cells. 2001. Pope John Paul II condemned the evils of research on embryonic stem cells. Those quotation marks are beautifully used because what they have actually done is say the Pope thinks it's evil, but it's not really. So this is actually a very subtle negative report of science and religion interface here. And this is the milder end of it. I think we got a lot less subtle. Okay, so 2003, and I haven't actually excluded any data points from this apart from letters that came in about science and religion that might have mentioned the Pope. So I've tried not to kind of pull out too much. So some of these might seem more relevant than others. But I wanted you to see the spectrum. This is overwhelmingly negative. This is a science magazine explicitly stating that the Catholic Church is basically behaving irresponsibly. I don't think there's any. In developing countries, the Church often tries to use its influence to block sex education and access to contraceptives. It's very clear where we stand on this, and we disapprove very strongly. This one is a bit more neutral. 2004, only it's very subtly undermining science and religion, or religion, I should say. I have to hold my hand up and say I wrote this. This is about John Kerry's stance before the last US election, and it's talking about how he stood up and said, I may not personally sanction abortion, but I respect the right of other people to have a different view to mine, which I thought was a very positive and good standpoint for a Christian to take. What happened was that many Catholic bishops, I think, came out and condemned him and refused him communion and all this kind of thing. It's quite a hoo-ha about it. My piece was, on the one hand, it was kind of saying, this is very good, a man of faith is actually having a rational position, taking a rational position. But the subtlety behind it was that many of other people of faith are actually behaving appallingly, but towards him they really need to get their act together. So it's kind of neutral in that it gives with one hand and takes away with the other. Here we are. This is out of our soundbites column, which is just a quote set as he said it this week, 22nd of August. I can't remember what year. I think it must be 2005. I actually don't know why we even put this in the magazine, because I can't really make sense of it. But it seems to be kind of saying, the Pope is saying, well, you can't just do what's possible, or people are tending to think that whatever's possible is okay. But it doesn't really come down on the other side. It doesn't seem to achieve anything for me to put this in, but I thought I'd just show it to you anyway. This one, on the other hand, on the death of Pope John Paul, is quite a nasty kick, I would say. The director of Christian Aid is just being quoted here as basically saying that the Pope who recently died actually he actually contributed to many deaths. That's an overwhelmingly negative. We didn't need to report that, I would say. We did report it as news. It was reported in newspapers that this came out. But I would say this fitted very much the trend at the time, which I showed you on the graph, which was to include many negative reports or things that reflected negatively on aspects of religion. 23rd of April 2005, this was a comment piece written by John Cornwell, who I believe is a practicing Catholic, if anybody knows that. This again, like my piece, is kind of neutral in that it represents the Pope very positively. At the same time, it represents the Church as a whole as Luddite and very much behind the times. So it's talking about, can the Pope help us, or did the Pope help Catholicism catch up with the modern world? So the overwhelming sort of tenor of the piece is the Church needs to catch up with the modern world. Okay, the next three kind of all take together. Cardinal Schoenborn comes out and says, you know, man is not the product of evolution in the New York Times. 3 US scientists go to the Pope and say, what are the Church's views on evolution as a result of this? So they wanted the Pope to clarify this. It's interesting that we report this because, you know, it has a link with science, obviously. But it's interesting that nobody asks, why do these scientists care? You know, and there's an implicit and really hidden agenda here, which is we do not show that the Church matters, that belief and religion matters. But when it comes to questions like this, actually these very actions show that belief and religion do matter in the modern world, because the scientists are having to go and ask what the position is. This is a much underreported phenomenon, I would say. And then, gleefully, we report the rift. So what we've got is a great story here, because we've got the director of the Vatican Observatory basically is pro-evolution in its entirety. Other members of the Catholic Church are anti-evolution in its entirety. And we have a rift, and New Scientist dutifully reports that there is a rift within one of the world's major religions. Here's another great use of quotes. This is done again. And I'm just going to go back again to what I said at the beginning. You have to understand the worldview and the bias and the prejudice of the science journalist. You know, and you won't see this thing. It's very insidious. But actually, it's all there. You know, we used a nickname. You know, we wouldn't use a nickname for any other figure, I would say. Any scientific figure would not get represented in the science media with a nickname. I can't think of it. You know, there were various things said about Colin Pillinger, but nobody ever wrote them down. But here we have, you know, it's actually legitimate, in effect, to kind of use this. And I know that newspapers do this all the time. And I feel that that was kind of inappropriate, really. Again, we've got the repetition of the intrinsically evil quote, this time used for condoms. A very negative report, I would say that. This is a comment piece written by Lawrence Krauss, who's a physicist. He wanted to make the point that scientists shouldn't just knee-jerk and criticize religious faith in general. Not because religious faith in general shouldn't be criticized, but just because it didn't fit with the good strategy. It's not a good strategy. And this, by this time, you know, we're in July 2006, so this is, you know, now, effectively. We are talking strategies and basically fighting talk. And the underlying current is that I think there is a war going on here, and it's being fought on many different fronts. And you have to be, you know, sometimes quite subtle in how you do it. But we're talking about a waste of energy here. We're talking about counterattack. You know, we've actually got kind of, you know, quite pejorative terms being used here. In that, you know, troops need to conserve their energy. They don't just counterattack, no knee-jerks. Even against groups who regularly distort scientific education in the name of religion. I mean, it's very, very clear where this stands. Here we are again, same month, July this year. Catholic stem cell researchers could be banned from taking Holy Communion. And then we went to various people and got the quotes. You know, the best one is, "This amounts to religious persecution of scientists," which you could agree with. The fact is that, again, the unspoken thing here is why people who don't care about religion, or claim not to care about religion, actually, you know, are worried by this. You know, Richard Dawkins would probably say, well, great, don't take communion, not a problem. But I think that's an interesting move. Biologist Joan Roughgarden thinks there's more to sex than reproduction. This is the beginning of an interview with her. She is a Christian prepared to stand up for evolution. Shock, horror. As if she's the only one. The phrasing of that again is pejorative. It's, you know, she's the only one. She's prepared to stand up for evolution. Roughgarden, a practicing Christian, has now ventured into the face-off. There we have, again, the conflict. You know, we've got a very strong conflict model being evolved here. So, here's an interesting one. Keith Ward, a professor of divinity, is commenting on a piece of cloth supposedly used to what Mark Price-Brown, which is going to go before the Pope next week. Nice, ridiculous quote. I mean, if anybody can tell me why this is a new scientist, then I would love to know. Because on the face of it, there's no scientific reasoning or anything behind this. Actually, this is here, in my opinion, because it's a gift to mock, you know, religious beliefs. I mean, you know, and whether or not you share them, whether or not you would mock them, it's still being used in that respect, I would say. I mean, it's just a great quote. God and science, you just can't please everyone. Again, this is a piece written by Steve Fuller, reviewing a book by Francis Collins, the head of the Human Genome. No, is it head of the Genome Project? It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Denying
on the table.
Sorry.
It's on the table.
Oh,
The book, yeah.
It is on the back. You might not want to read it after the next time. Denying the real conflict between religion and science is a sure formula for confusion. Well, you know, there we have it explicitly stated. There is a conflict, and you better not deny it. This is part taken from the review. So, director of the Human Genome Project, he's member of a group of 3,000 Christians, which aims to render science consistent with its beliefs. So the agenda is to change science and distort science, as it were, effectively, the way that's written. Collins' mission is to deny any real conflict. He wants to square things for scientists who don't want intelligence denial on their doorstep, but who also don't want to examine their own beliefs too closely. I'm not sure he'd be very pleased with that review, to be honest. And again, I won't say whether I agree or disagree. I've actually, I've looked through a lot of that book, and I would argue that there is some truth to this review. But what I would say is actually, it's very clear where this stands. And again, it's a very negative paintbrush effect over the whole issue of religion and how it interacts with science. Now we're coming sort of almost up to date. Pope Benedict hosting a seminar. The key guest is Schoenborn, who's known to agree with intelligent design. George Coyne, just last week, was replaced as director of the Vatican Observatory. Remember, we encountered him before, and he was a very positive kind of figure because he shares, the science journalist prejudices. And so, because of that, on an occasion that you won't see repeated very often at all, New Scientist decides to report on rumours. Not really good journalistic practice generally, but it suited our purposes at this point.
Yeah.
Rumours about he was removed because of his vocal views on evolution. Let's put a bit of balance in there. Coyne effectively denies this, but it's okay because we've said it and it's out there, and we've achieved a purpose there. Coyne is reported as saying that he wished to be replaced because he's been treated for cancer. Well, Coyne is kind of one of us. He's a good guy. He believes in evolution. Of course, he'd do the honourable thing. Bang up to this month now. Again, I haven't included this for any strong reason, except that it was there. And the Pope is rejecting ideas that humans are a product of evolution and is looking at it. I think that's a fairly neutral report, in that it's factual at least. And then this is from an editorial where we triumphantly talk about the discovery of Tiktaalik, which was actually predicted. I mean, it's a beautiful story, but there's this idea that there's a gap between the fish that moved onto land. Scientists say they managed to kind of work out the kind of geology that you would need in order to find fossils that showed that you could get fish moving onto land, and then they went and they found the fossilized skeletons. So it was a great triumph for science, and we, very much trumpeted that in an editorial. And I think we're on the last. This is the last one now. Again, I'm not really sure why this is here or what it's even saying, but it's here. So I think it may have even backfired, to be honest. What Festio actually meant, I read sort of around this and went back to the report. The philosophy he's talking about is the philosophy which allows you to get away from a literal interpretation of Genesis and talk about the creation of the universe from a philosophical point of view. The way that quote is extracted, and that's all you got on the page, is that there's a controversy in the United States, so we're kind of kicking up the conflict model again, and saying, there's a lack of awareness of a thing called philosophy. I wonder whether they're talking about philosophy of science, I don't know. But at least we've got the conflict out there again. So those are all those data points, and that is pretty much all that I've found. I only removed things that weren't related to science and religion. So the question becomes now, why? What's happened? And I showed you that graph at the beginning, and I think, unscientific as it is, I think you'd agree that there was a change in terms of negative reporting, positive reporting of religion, or negative antagonism, if you want to look at it that way, from 93 to about 2000. And then after 2000, there was not one report that I would call as a positive report on science and religion in New Scientist, which kind of shocked me, I have to say, as part of that organisation, because I know that it's not an editorial policy decision. And I want to be clear on that this is not that the people of New Scientist have decided that their guns are out for religion. This is just a sense of the prevailing attitude in science, and we're reporting things that are going on in science, or that are related to science. And when religion is coming up after 2000, there is effectively always this antagonism between the scientists who we know and love and respect and need to keep on side, remember, and the people of faith. But of course, it's not all people of faith. What we've got is a war on science, and I would argue that this is not some artificial construct. This is actually happening, and I've kind of looked into this, and we've done features on this in New Scientist, and I'm fairly convinced of this, that William Dembski, who is part of the Discovery Institute, who promoted a lot of the intelligent design material, says science has a track record of taking young Christians and derailing them when they go to the academy, and they lose their faith. And then the statement continued, he said this effectively is going to stop. They released a document, or they didn't release it, somebody leaked a document called the Wedge Strategy, in which the fellows of the Discovery Institute decided that they were going to stop this happening by basically attacking science at what they perceived as its weakest point, which is evolution, which is where things ramped up. And this was around kind of 98, 99, it started to come out into the consciousness of science, I think, around 2000, 2001 started growing. The Templeton Foundation, who we've mentioned, I think sort of 96, 97, were actually funding the Discovery Institute, or some of the people behind this. I think, in fact, they were funding William Dembski in the mid-90s. And then, by the end of the 90s, they stopped funding them completely and realised that the whole thing had become a political campaign, and the Templeton Foundation said, we don't fund campaigns, we fund investigations into science and religion. So obviously by that time it was becoming very clear that something was going on. There are various different attitudes to this, whether there really is a war on science or not. I am of the opinion that there is, actually. But it's a very localized war. It's a very small segment of the faith population had a war on science. But the thing that you've got to realize is that science journalists need a story. Science actually needs a story sometimes. And that's why it's getting reported as if it was all of the faith community. Now this I came across yesterday, in fact. This is an invitation to a conference called Beyond Belief, Science, Religion, Reason and Survival, the Salk Institute for Biology in California in November. Now this is quite an interesting way to advertise a conference. This is invitation only, by the way, so not everybody can attend this conference. Just 40 years after a famous Time magazine cover asked, is God dead? The answer appears to be a resounding no. According to a survey by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life in the current issue of Foreign Policy magazine, God is winning. Now, this comes from, as you see, an Institute for Biology It's a science institute. The invitation carries on like this. I'm sorry, there's very much to read there. After 2 centuries, could this be the twilight of the Enlightenment project and the beginning of a new age of unreason? Will faith and dogma trump rational inquiry, or will it be possible to reconcile religious and scientific worldviews? Can evolutionary biology, anthropology, and neuroscience help us to better understand how we construct beliefs, experience awe, fear, and empathy, and create the kind of narratives that have traditionally sustained societies? Can we treat religion as a natural phenomenon? Can we invent a science of morality? They're all good questions, but actually they're part of the war. And this is the counterattack. And interestingly, as I said, this conference is invitation only. This conference, the conference organisers have so far invited only scientists. They say they're going to invite a few sort of people of faith who have links with science, but effectively, this is a rallying the troops conference. This is a sense that we need to construct some of these things in order to take away the ground from the religious people. I may be reading a lot into that, but I don't think I am, to be honest. It's very clear that this is the kind of Dawkins-esque worldview, where you can, if you work hard enough, eradicate religion from the world. And this is going on in November, as I said, this conference. They haven't yet got around to inviting any people of faith to contribute to that, because it's the idea is that scientists can do this by themselves. They don't need the input. So we're on to the propaganda wars now. These are excerpts from New Scientist, from my favourite evolutionary psychologist, Robin Dunbar, professor at the University of Liverpool. I think his arguments are laughable. To be honest, I mean, I find them slightly embarrassing. But this actually is the cutting edge of scientists getting to grips with faith and understanding what religion is all about. And if you have a worldview that is exclusively scientific and rational, then you have to explain away the existence of religion and all that kind of thing. And this is Dunbar's sort of best effort, and he's the kind of the key guy for this, by the way. I kind of complained about this coming out in the magazine, to be honest, because I just thought it was, by the standards of any other branch of science, this would be laughed out of existence for me. So, religions bond societies because they exploit a whole suite of rituals that are extremely good at triggering the release of endorphins. So any of you who've been to church have really experienced that rush of endorphins, I know. So you've got these natural opioids coursing through your brain in the middle of that sermon. And you're just loving it. Endorphins come into that home when pain is modest but persistent. Then they flood the brain, creating a mild high. Perhaps that is why religious people often seem so happy. Now, it's evident to me that Robin Dunbar doesn't know many religious people. Because in my experience, they're not really that much happier per se than anybody else. And certainly not when they're walking down the street or doing their shopping at Sainsbury's. It's not this general, we haven't got these kind of endorphins coursing around us all the time. But of course, it's useful to be able to construct this kind of argument, because you want to have a piece that says, this is why people believe in these strange things. It's endorphins. It gets better. This may be why religious rituals so often involve activities that are physically stressful. Singing, dancing, repetitive swaying or bobbing movements, awkward postures like kneeling, or the lotus position, counting beads, and occasionally even seriously painful activities like self-flagellation. I mean, come on, Robin. It almost doesn't need comment, does it? But for me, this is the best at the moment that science is doing, really, in terms of explaining religion. But it has to do this job, and because people have set up this conflict model, and there is this conflict going on, I think largely instigated by the intelligent design people, by William Dembski and others. They have actively started this war, and science is fighting back. And science is exclusively on the side of, science journalism is exclusively on the side of science. So we actually print this best effort. I don't think anybody was very happy about it, but at least it had Robin Dunbar's name. Okay, so I'm going to move away slightly now from the science and religion aspect, from the journalism aspect, and look at sort of a few current efforts and thoughts about science and religion proponents. And I'm never quite clear, I did this Templeton Fellowship, I'm never quite clear whether there's a concerted research effort into science and religion, or whether it's It's almost like something that people do in their spare time. I know Dennis does, whether, how serious it is. But one of the things I want to really point out with this, because this meeting is about science and religion, and I think this is an issue that science and religion maybe has to look at. I'm going to offer a couple of critiques of some things that people have said. John Polkinghorne wrote a book called The Scientists Theologians, or something like that, I think. And a couple of things as a science journalist that he said in that book, I really had this kind of mild Robin Dunbar kind of response to. Because he talks about having a trusting attitude to the scriptures as a basis for his beliefs. He talks about the danger of the subordination of the theological to the scientific. And he talks about the due degree of autonomy that each pattern of inquiry must maintain if it's to be true to itself. In relation to other faiths, he says, I must hold to the truth of my heritage. Now, I'm quoting him, obviously, very out of context here, and I've warned Dennis that I'm going to do the same to him in a minute. But what I want to say is, as a science journalist, you see, I look at this issue of science and religion, and what people are writing, and what they're saying, and for me, that's not quite good enough to be included on the stage with science, because science doesn't have these, or shouldn't have these kind of prerequisites, these non-negotiables. And and a trusting attitude to the scriptures is fine as a person of faith. If you're talking about trying to elucidate something in science, then it doesn't, for me, serve as a very good basis. And I would say that the same thing with all of these. So for me, as a science journalist, and I completely understand these as a Christian, and I can kind of see where he's coming from on all of them, but as a science journalist, that other side of my duality, I find them unconvincing, to be honest. And so, in a sense, I take little notice of them. The same is true, as this is from Rebuilding the Matrix, Dennis's book, where he admits that the degree to which religious inferences can be drawn from the physical properties of the universe is really quite limited. To me, that actually argues against issues of science and religion, and taking science and religion very seriously. And you can come back at me on this. I'll run out of the door, but you can come back. But I would say that what it says is, a very honest admission that there is a limit to what you can do effectively with looking at cosmology, looking at theology, and trying to pull the two together. And this was a quotation in reference to the weak anthropic principle, saying scientific argumentation can be used to sort through the speculations, to see which one fits the data most coherently, provided no attempt is made to restrict the evidence allowed to scientific data alone. As a science journalist, I find that last phrase very difficult. This idea that you don't only use scientific data, and again, to me, that just kind of makes me pull back and think this maybe isn't the right approach. Then, as I said, I'm trying to be provocative and controversial here. So, is it an irrelevance as it stands? This whole sort of effort into looking at science and religion from a science journalist perspective. Interestingly, Isaac Newton seemed to advocate not really mixing the two, which I thought was quite provocative. And George Johnson in the New York Times, who also did the Science Journalism Fellowship, sponsored by the Templeton Foundation, basically felt, when he wrote in the New York Times, he said that the spiritual stuff is extraneous to him, that he's an atheist, he's a self-proclaimed atheist, and while he respects people of faith, he just doesn't know where they're coming from, and so he doesn't really get what the point is that they're trying to make, or why they think that their point is relevant. And this, as people of faith and people interested in science and religion, is the thing that you're going to get from science journalists. Is not really sure why you expect me to take that particular point on board. I don't know what that was. Oh, there was a picture that obviously didn't come through. There was supposed to be a picture there of a guy called Joseph Agar Beat, who was a Methodist minister. He's my great discovery, actually. I was in a second-hand bookshop in my hometown of Lewis. And I just came across this volume of lectures that he gave in 1889, which is kind of shortly after Darwin produced his On the Origin of Species. And it was to an audience of ministers, a series of lectures about, and it was an effort to kind of try and see if we could get the gospel, the Christian message, away from any kind of conflict with evolution. And I think he made a really good attempt to kind of do this. Part of what he did was, he said our moral sense and our, what he considered our God-given kind of moral sense must be the most important aspect of the way we make judgments. And whatever is in the Holy Scripture has to kind of be taken with a pinch of salt in some ways. He ended up about 10, 20 years later being accused of heresy for actually saying that the soul wasn't immortal and that it was unreasonable to expect people to burn in hell forever. He was allowed to continue being a minister, but only on the basis of never talking about science and religion again. And this whole thing sort of, for me, comes down to, where science and religion actually, I think, is important to the scientific debate. And I think what I don't want to have is this kind of sense that it's kind of slightly irrelevant and comes with all these sort of non-negotiables to impinge on the fact that I think, religious people of faith actually have a contribution to make to these debates. And the way science journalism is at the moment, the way science is at the moment, they are in danger of being sidelined and pushed out of it at any opportunity. So if a scientist or a science journalist can say, well, you know what, those people, they come at it with this non-negotiable attitude to Scripture, or they come at it saying, well, they have to hold to their faith traditions, then we don't need to take account of anything they say. And this is the kind of warning that I want to kind of put across, is that there is an anti-religion feeling around at the moment. There is a kind of war going on. And if you want to contribute and keep contributing as a person who's thought about these issues, as a person of faith, then actually, there may be some baggage that needs to go, is kind of my message, really. So I wrote this was New Scientist in 2004. You may accuse me of completely turning tail here. Opinions born of religious faith have come to be seen as preformed and inflexible. This is a shame because religious people have a lot to contribute to rational debate. I still think that's true. In November 2005 I said, those Christians who say their faith somehow gives them special authority on questions of bioethics couldn't be more wrong. They are, if anything, less well placed than everyone else. Now I will justify that statement because my argument is you have to come without presuppositions and non-negotiables. And you have to be able to come as a human being with a moral compass. And I would argue, and I'm sure we will argue, that Richard Dawkins' moral compass isn't somehow misaligned. I don't think that Richard Dawkins would turn into Joseph Mengele. I think his moral compass is quite probably in line with most other people's. And so by saying that we've got some kind of special ability as a person of faith, of whatever faith, to kind of interject on these issues where Richard Dawkins doesn't have that thing, I think that's a claim that has to be kind of investigated. And I'm not sure you can make that claim. I haven't seen it well substantiated. I'm willing to hear it. So if your faith does not allow you to question the validity of a Bible versus relevance to issues of modern bioethics, or to sanction abortion in any form, you are not coming to those debates as a scientist or a lawyer. You are coming as a well-informed but partisan lobbyist, and you should say so. Controversial, and you might want to pick me up on that maybe, but I still stand by that. I think people, in particular, I'll pick on John Polkinghorne because he's not here to defend himself, but he sits on, or has sat on HFEA committees, for instance, as a person of faith and a scientist, and thought long and hard through these things. Dawkins' argument is, why not ask the butcher to do the same? What makes a person of faith somehow more able to kind of process these things than somebody who collects the garbage, which is another example that he used. So areas where science and religion might produce fruit useful to science journalists. I think science is doing very, very badly in, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be alive and dead? But the Terry Schiavo case, for instance, made it very clear, for us at New Scientists, that we didn't have a clue what scientists felt about this, and scientists don't have a clue either. And I think these are possibly issues that science and religion people, science and religion researchers might well find some fruit in. Is religion inevitable? Is it a huge one? I'm sure there are people doing work on that. It seems to me that Dawkins lives in this kind of strange world where he wants to eradicate religion and doesn't realise that the vacuum will fill with religion. And there may be others. But I would suggest that some of the work, if this were to go on, it does need somehow to be dissociated from the previous efforts that have somehow always come tainted with a sense of these are non-negotiables and we trust our scripture and you need to just respect that. Because I'm afraid that in a scientific world now, and in the world of science journalism and science generally, there's very little respect, as I think that graph has shown, and those examples that I've shown you before. There is every effort to discredit people of religion and people of faith, and there's certainly very little respect for people of religion and faith. As Martin said, it kind of gets laughed at, really. So I'm just going to run through some conclusions. I am convinced that scientific reporting of religion is going through an antagonistic phase. And I haven't seen any counterexamples, to be honest, certainly in New Scientist. Scientific American ran a huge editorial on April Fool's Day last year, where they absolutely took the mickey out of the intelligent design debate, just ruthlessly. And it was ruthless, and it was very unlike Scientific American to do that, actually, because they're a very humorless bunch of people. But it was very funny, and it was very well done. And it was completely, these things are deliberate. They're not, these things are not accidents. These are deliberately done. I believe this has arisen from a battle between different worldviews. Science reporters, if you read the Science Press, they're on the side of science. Make no mistakes about it. And reporting of science and religion issues is largely restricted to conveying negative views of religion. I would say the current efforts in science and religion are just not cutting the mustard for a science journalist. They don't give us that who, what, when, why, something of real sort of depth and profundity to report on. Although they're very convincing to people within areas of faith, I don't think they're convincing to people outside of areas of faith. So it depends what you want to achieve, I guess. And I'm concerned that religious voices are going to become sidelined in ethics debates, unless they become very fundamentalist voices. I should put that caveat in, that the fundamentalists have no trouble making themselves heard, because they have a very black and white agenda, and science journalists love a black and white agenda. As we talked about balance before, if we're reporting an issue of ethics, you want to go to the guy who completely disagrees with the scientists, not the guy who's saying, well, the scientists have got some good points, but let me just qualify a few of them. That doesn't cut it for a science journalist. And so what will happen, as these things get into the press, as they're read by people in government and whatever, then there will just become this sense that religious voices, unless they're fundamentalists and they're forcing themselves onto the agenda, actually are just not really worth going to. For me, this will change if science and religion proponents are willing to come down off the fence and start to openly condemn fundamentalist approaches. Now, I know Keith Ward has done some of this, but I don't see it really widely reported. And in some ways, what I'm saying is people, if you want to win or you want to be in this war, then you have to come down and join the side of science, even though your heart tells you that you want to be on the middle ground. That's just a facet of journalism, I would argue, and a facet of humanity. And I think it's sad, but I think there are issues there. And I think that maybe there are other areas to contribute to. As I said, I know very little in some ways about what research goes on into science and religion. I know a few of the figures involved, but if there are efforts to kind of do this reconciliation of science and religion, faith, then I think actually they could do with maybe not ploughing some of the old ground and finding new ground to plough, which may lead nicely into some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael. And Shirley has stirred up plenty of questions.
Can I throw in a few observations? It's kind of a question. Just about the whole science and religion field. I'm interested in what you say, coming in as a journalist. what do you think, bearing in mind, as far as I know, the whole field of science and religion is quite new in the last few decades. I mean, there used to be that many books out there, now there are millions. A lot of people who are into science and religion, as you said, do it in their spare time, so you have to go a long way before you're actually saying anything original, which is probably why there are so many introductory books to science and religion. And speaking as someone who's tried to wade my way through them all at the moment, and there aren't that many theologians involved in, maybe this isn't right, I don't think there are that many theologians, professional theologians involved. But I guess the main thing I was interested in is how much you think the creation evolution debate is distracting people from in science and religion from actual serious academic study and serious contribution.
Could everyone hear the question at the back there? You could all hear? Okay, the real question here is about to what extent has the creation evolution debate in the States particularly distracted people involved in the science religion field from kind of more serious work, and this is somewhat distorted the whole debate. I think that was the core of the question.
I would say that it's...
Michael, do you want to stand up? I don't know if that's needed.
Yeah, that's
yes,
right.
yeah.
My answer to that would be that I'm sure it's not stifled other areas of research, but I'm sure it's stifled reporting on other areas of research. In that, the science, the creation evolution debate and the ID debate fills enough pages. And you don't kind of need to go anywhere else if you want a science and religion story. You know, it's there, it's on a plate, it's full of conflict and controversy and people slagging each other off. It's great copy. Whereas the other stuff is more subtle, perhaps. And so I wouldn't say necessarily it's distracted people from researching other areas, but it certainly will affect the reporting of other areas. But I would also say that reporting research as a science journalist, it has to be saying something that you kind of can summarize in a couple of sentences, and if you can't do that, then it's actually very difficult to write about.
Just as a writer on that back of that question, I mean, one always gets the impression actually that the media in this country are hugely influenced by the media in the States, and almost the feeling I get when often media people phone me up, as they do, is that there's a story going in the States, we don't quite know what it means, we don't really understand it, but it must mean something important because it's big in the States, so we better report it. Now, I'm being a little cynical here, but is that how you read the situation?
It's a difficult point for us because we're selling in the States more and more every week, and we're actually, in some ways, very conscious of our American readership. There's no editorial change between what comes out in Britain and what comes out in America. The US is driving the global agenda in so many ways, and people want to know what's going on in the US, and there are these kind of massive conflicts going on in the US that are really not massive conflicts over here at all. And so there is a sense that you read these newspaper reports of these things going on, and you kind of expect to find mayhem on the streets somehow, and actually over here they make no difference at all. And I think there's a lot of cultural differences that have led to that, and there's good research being done on the cultural aspects behind the whole science and religion debate in the States, as I'm sure you're aware. And it's just not the same here. It's different culture, and so we don't have the same kind of problem. But we're reporting in the same way, I would say.
I could just make one other little comment here on the number of books. I mean, I did publish a book way back on science and religion, and it was published in 1972, and it was called Beyond Science. And I would say at that time, the number of books on science and faith, that I knew about, you could sort of count on the fingers of maybe one hand or two. I mean, there really were not very many books around, so it's certainly true. I think there has been a huge explosion in the literature, if one simply counting books.
And I just add that the same happened with cosmology. The cosmology book did to a penny now, because a couple of them did really well. People are kind of riding on the back of that. They all say the same thing.
Yes.
One of the points that you made towards the end was that one of the issues is to do with world views being in clash and form one with the other. I wonder if I could just make a comment about something that happened to me, and then sort of ask the question on riding on that, if that's okay. I started here in Cambridge under John Polkinghorne for a short while when I was training for ministry in the Church of England at Ridley. And I did a dissertation on, I Einstein as a scientific figure, but also as a religious figure, or as he perceived in terms of perception of what his religion was. And one of the things I also did was to interview 6 vicars in the Church of England here in Cambridge, or associated with churches here in Cambridge. And I wanted to ask the question whether they would feel comfortable in bringing issues of science to the churches that they were ministering in, and whether they would themselves do that or invite a specialist to come in to speak. And I wanted to ask a little bit about their educational background. And I was suspecting that people of a certain generation had very little science in their education, and perhaps a little bit more recently, a bit more science has been available on the general educational level. And I think that what I found, a very small sample, was that people who had very little science in their background, it was because they were already attracted to the humanities, and therefore theology goes down that route. And so therefore in theological education we have the humanities of different sorts being to the fore, but very little to do with the sciences or conversation with the sciences. And I then looked at particular institutions I've been involved with in the past years in my life, and looked to see whether science was in any way an option or something that was compulsory to do anything with in the kind of training for ministry or in theological education. And I think part of the problem of the clash of worldviews that seem to be coming out of it is that in science journalism, you're saying that you have to have a science degree and you have this very pro-science way of thinking. And the way that the scientific method works and that mentality is to exclude other ways of explaining things. And therefore you can understand that when you do science and do a science degree, you get a meta-narrative that goes with it, which says that science is the only reliable source of information and therefore way you can go forward. And in theology and in other disciplines, you'll have a different form of authority and sort of the way that you can make judgments about things and say certain things. And the scientific way of thinking is really not really engaged with very much, because it's basically more to do with human sciences and either internal beliefs or to do with philosophy or it's to do with the meta-narratives which are different. So possibly, my observation, my question really, is to do with the education that we have in this country that forces us down 2 routes on the sciences or the humanities. And therefore that has an effect in terms of the people who are religiously articulate, theologically articulate, and those who are in the sciences and scientifically articulate. And there is a clash there because there's just very little purpose in bringing the 2 together at the educational level in our country. Would you say that part of your own experience and see that in science journalism?
I mean, education, and science education is a big issue, and I mean, you talk to anybody in the science department at university, they'll tell you science education is plummeting, and the quality of science education is plummeting. I think this is a concern for science. I mean, it's interesting that I would say for most people, you know, the man on the street, as it were, you know, they don't care at all about the issues of science very much. You know, I don't think science pervades the public consciousness in the way that other things do. And they're just kind of content to let the scientists get on with the science for the most part. And I think that probably does stem from education. You know, when I tell people I'm a physicist, people always tell me that was their worst subject at school. You know, that's kind of the end of the conversation. So, I mean, there is an issue, but I don't know how much that leads to the clash of cultures. I mean, I think generally there isn't a clash. I mean, you know, nobody's walking around on the streets of Cambridge, you know, wringing their hands over the clash of cultures between science and the humanities. What people do is generally ignore science because it's hard and it's just somebody else's back. You know. So, but you know, at a higher level, you know, policy level, at government level, educational, you know, standards level, there is an issue that's about to be before, and I don't think that can be traced to educational roots.
There may not be at the moment, but 45 years ago, I think it was C.P. Snowden, a lecturer in this university at Cambridge, and said something about the 2 cultures in a little book about this, and that's a famous item there, you know, to read through. And he saw a bifurcation, education in this culture between the scientists and the people who study humanities.
I think probably, I mean, speaking as a scientist here, if you look around the scientific community, one sees the 2 cultures very clearly around still. You know, when it comes to discussions of philosophy or religion or humanities generally, people are foundering, you know, to a large degree, actually, with some wonderful rare exceptions. But if you're just talking average scientists out there, if I might just say a little survey, informal survey I did around in the coffee room some years ago, I mean, just down the road here in my lab, because I was interested to find out what people thought about postmodernity, postmodernism, in the scientific community. So I just asked around the postdocs and the PhD students during coffee break just to find out, what they might feel about this. And we had a problem in our survey because not a single person knew what it was. I thought this was hilarious, because down the road here, the English department is full of people sort of saturated with postmodernism, and the dear old scientists just didn't even know what it was. We're completely lost. So
Ignorance is bliss.
ignorance is bliss, So even though in the popular culture, music and films they watch every day, of course, they're completely influenced by the culture of postmodernity. So it's a question. Yes.
Is the media driving or reflecting this polarisation? In the sense, it seems to me to be polarisation that is a lot to do with the problem, of course, the problem. It's a bit like, getting a fascist and a communist to debate the finer points of democracy. You just don't get the debate where you need it. And because, the people are out at the extremes and haven't really had the time or the inclination to think about, the bits in the middle, which, to my mind, is where we need to much more informed debate.
A short answer is I think the media is reflecting. I think that there is really a clash between people who would, and this is over education. Let's remember. I mean, the ID debate is not about what's right, what's wrong in science terms. Science has ring-fenced its own territory. I mean, nobody's saying that the journals are getting infiltrated with intelligent design articles, because they're not. I mean, there's hardly anything in reference journals on intelligent design. This is about what education we're giving to children. And scientists are coming in and saying, we've got to protect science education. Intelligent design people are coming in and saying, we've actually got to protect people's right not to believe in evolution, as it were. And that is real, and I think the media are reflecting it, they're not driving it.
But who has driven that process of communicating the concern about the media and so on, about the education and so on? If you wheel back 50 years...
Depends how far you go back.
If you wheel back 50
it's like
years...
the Northern Ireland conflict, really.
I guess there was very little of this kind of discussion.
Well, people would argue, and probably quite rightly, that the kind of growing arrogance of scientists led to a lot of this. But there was this effort to destabilise science quite deliberately by people from very fundamentalist Christian backgrounds. And science reacted against this. And the way the fundamentalists wanted to destabilise was by getting education or destabilising science education effectively, and putting stickers on textbooks, changing, writing their own textbooks, rewriting things. And the scientists reacted to that, justifiably in my opinion. But if you want to go back, it's because science has become a very dominant paradigm, and certain people have felt very threatened by that.
Yes.
Just following up on that, and just going from your graph that you had, there seemed to be a correlation between this antagonization with religion, as reported in New Scientist, with recent world events such as the rise of, more fear to do with Islamic terrorism, Bush putting religion more on the agenda in the United States. How much do you think this antagonism that you're seeing in the media is actually reflecting a fear of sort of world events and the reaction to world events, rather than some philosophical shift per se within culture?
I think that's a very, very complicated issue. Not wanting to sidestep it completely, I would say that there are issues when you have somebody who holds fundamentalist Christian views in the White House, who is supported by various people who have their own agendas and are, have money to support those agendas. And the Discovery Institute, I mean, when you trace the web of funding behind the Discovery Institute, it's terrifying, to be honest. And the same, you find this web of funding where people will be given to the Discovery Institute and to the Republican Party, and there is this kind of sense of who's got fingers in whose pies. Well, everybody's got fingers in everybody's pies. This is the kind of the right wing in America, and this is how politics works. I mean, this is the whole thing. But politics, its agenda stretches across education, and people are always going to be getting into power with specific agendas that are based on their own prejudices. So I fear for the day when Richard Dawkins is Prime Minister.
Could that be driving the antagonism, though, rather than a philosophical shift? So that if, say, a Democrat gets in, that's everyone will...
Oh yeah, I mean these are polarised positions, so anybody getting the power, there's automatically a reaction to it, and we must do something about it. But we're getting onto very different ground that I'm not expert at.
But I think you're right. I mean, I think the whole problem in the American debate is that the polarization of sort of science religion is also tied up with politics to a very large degree, and ethics and stem cells, and it's all rolled into one very
And
package.
also a sense
So
that
that's the
there's a
problem.
moral degradation in society, and things were much better back in the 1600s. It's a very, very big. I mean, people say it's not like the good old days of the 50s. We need to return to more morality and no teenagers on the streets, and stop them drinking and having sex, and as if they never did in the 1950s. It's this kind of rosy-eyed view of what America used to be that also informs this whole situation.
Really.
Yeah, in a way, it's a pity that all those issues are lumped together: creationism, ID, and abortion, stem cells, and so on. Because I think that's most regrettable. Because some of the ethical issues, it seems to me, like stem cell research, abortion, and so on. And on those issues, I can't see that scientists have any expertise.
No, I
to
agree.
bring. I mean, what makes them special?
Right.
They know how to do things,
Yes.
but they don't know whether it's right to do them or not. So, I mean, and it might very well be that someone with faith, actually, which I wouldn't see as irrational, like John Hawke, actually has more to contribute to these sorts of debates than someone just coming at it as a scientist, qua scientist.
Yeah. I mean, I respect the point of view. I'm not sure I agree with you. I mean, I think, as you say, the scientists don't know. They don't have any special knowledge that enables them to understand what to do about these ethical issues. I would say that people of faith may feel that they do, but I've never been quite convinced that they really do.
There might be some more common ground, though actually possible at any rate, within the Roman Catholic tradition of natural law, the whole idea of which is that there's something that's common is given to us in nature, that might lead us to common set of principles.
Can people hear at the back this discussion? Just wave if you can, because then we can get people to turn around. Yeah. So. Okay, just before we come back to anyone who hasn't asked a question yet, who'd like to?
Well, just a very brief comment. I find there's often a confusion between people who hold a moral view on a rather an absolute basis, such as the Catholic view on abortion, and people who argue in consequentialist terms. And very often the discussions about whether something is right or wrong, and I'll give an example tomorrow, I'm afraid you'll miss it, but I'll send you my stuff, about how we had an issue about food where there were ethical issues involved, and the scientists can only argue, in my experience, in consequentialist terms. Does it help people or doesn't it? And a lot of the stem cell debate's been on that, in that terms. Then there's a muddle with the more absolutionist position. And where John Polkinghorne was actually on our committee, and where he was helpful is not because he was Christian, but because he'd been trained in philosophy. And he disentangled some of these muddled arguments we were having.
Yeah.
And it's your point, actually, about the lack of training of scientists in understanding how to deal with these problems, which have suddenly been dumped in our lap.
Okay, Ruth, you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of come back to Rodney and say, I wondered if, see what you think, it was talking about, I can't remember who mentioned it before, talking about sowing the seeds of doubt. And all you need to do is sow a seed of doubt, whether it's right or wrong, some kind of evidence, and you immediately, people sort of go, oh, I don't really know, and switch off. And I wonder if the climate change and possibly stem cells as well, and creation or evolution all kind of go in the same pot, really, because if it's a kind of feedback loop of people sowing a seed of doubt from whatever political agenda or whatever religious agenda they're on. Religious people then take it up and sow it back, if you like.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got students who, they'll sit in lectures and argue with their lecturers about things. So the lecturers get annoyed. So next year they put something in their lecture about, some Christians think this, and they antagonise the students already, and you've got this kind of loop of people
Yeah.
antagonising each other, and that's in university circles, and it must be through.
Well, that was the strategy of the Discovery Institute, wasn't it? Was to, what they said was, let's hear the controversy. That when there was no controversy among scientists, and there was this sense that scientists are suppressing something, and what they did was very successfully. Actually, they sowed doubt into the whole issue, where actually there wasn't really doubt. There was there was scientific gaps, as it were, but not doubt. And this is it's just propaganda, isn't it? We did it in the war. You sow doubt amongst your enemy, you kind of get this kind of sense of, maybe I shouldn't be fighting for what I'm fighting for. Maybe these people are telling me something, actually don't know all the answers, and you're halfway to winning the battle. So yeah.
Well, it sounds terribly negative, but in a way to unsow the doubt, that's where the science and religion people have the opportunity to.
I completely agree with you, but whether they can do it is another question. It requires actually probably going further than they want to.
Martin, yes.
Yeah. I suspect this is a problem that we share. As a science journalist, I need science stories. And because I'm interested in science and religion, I can write about the odd bit of neurotheology, the occasional bit of cosmology, the issues that we've talked about which slightly impinge on religion. But in terms of the dialogue between science and religion, I've reported that there is one. I've reported that there is one in somewhere prestigious like Harvard or this Cambridge and so on. Where's the next story going to come from? How do we find more science and religion stories?
Well, this is the whole issue of news, isn't it? Has anything happened? No. Well, where's the story? And this is a problem that, if you want to get a science and religion story into new scientists, there's got to be something new about it, and what is there to say? I've been asked to go to this conference that I mentioned in California in November. So, and interestingly, I've been asked to go and kind of do a report from there on science and religion and a conversation. And subsequently found out that there won't be any people of faith there, so it'll be a conversation about science and religion between scientists alone. So that'll be a very interesting thing. But so that in some ways will get it in, but it's a very skewed kind of way of doing it. So we'll see. But I agree. This is in a sense what I was kind of trying to say about the whole science and religion issue is, where are the stories coming from? What is the research? Where will they impact? So that I've got a story, and I guess this is a thing for people researching in this area. Is there a way to have an impact? Really, again, you can kind of come down on the side of well, we think evolution is fine, there's no need to mess with that, but that's not news really, because we scientists knew that already.
Yeah.
So we're in this horrible position where we're sort of trying to encourage a debate between science and religion and encourage this conversation, but actually, it's very difficult to report on it because the things that are said are not suited necessarily to publication in the news outlet.
Can I just make a comment, sorry,
Yes.
about what you just said about this conference in November? I thought it was very interesting, your assumption just now, because you said that only scientists have been invited to this particular conference, but not people of faith. But there will be some scientists there who will have faith. So you're making
Yes, there will. Yeah, there
between
will.
the
I wonder
scientists
if
who are
they've
going to
been
be there
invited.
and the people who are of faith.
Yeah.
But surely what we're talking perhaps is about professional.
Well, that was actually
religious
from the
speakers.
email that I got, is that we have not yet invited anyone of faith. And there's a list of people who have been invited. The list of, I know the physicists who've been invited, and none of those are people of faith. So,
Right.
And it was where Francis Crick finished up, didn't he? And looking for the final solution. So it's a congenial place for people looking for alternatives.
well, yeah, I'm not sure they're looking for alternatives exactly. They're just looking for arguments.
Just to flag out one thing, which sort of reflects also on a couple of things you said, but I wonder, okay, so you're picturing the general science journalist, which really I think means the new scientist journalist on the whole, as someone who's pretty generally hostile towards faith. This is a real thing. And
I think Martin said the same about this.
And I think Martin probably said the same about Science Unit. So one wonders actually whether people with science background who end up in some of the media and who seem to hold to this sort of scientistic view quite strongly, that is to say the view that only scientific knowledge is worth bothering about or is valid knowledge or supported knowledge, You see, when I think about that, when I think about the scientific community generally, again, if I think about people in my lab down the road, if you ask them, do you think scientific knowledge is really the only kind of knowledge that's worth writing about? They would all laugh.
Yeah.
They would all laugh, because they think it's ridiculous. So I wonder if there's a sort of gap here between, your general average scientist who has a normal life and has a family and kids and has to go do the shopping and, obviously doesn't believe that scientific knowledge is the only knowledge worth bothering about, because they know that you have to use lots of kinds of knowledge to operate in this world and make sense of it. Therefore, so how is it that there's sort of clustering of people in the media who seem to be quite isolated from the scientific community in this way?
I don't think it's a good point. I think I would say that it's not that they don't, that we, let's use we, don't think that there's other valid forms of knowledge. It's just that when we're reporting and doing our day-to-day job, all the other forms of knowledge are not relevant to our job. So our job is to fill the pages or the airwaves with science-related stories, and we're not there to do pieces on how much I love my kids.
So it sounds, just to pursue that a little bit then, that actually if that was really the strict policy, that a strict kind of Stephen Jay Gould type of non-overlapping magisterium would be the only way to go, and therefore we are a science journal, therefore we don't report on religion, history, politics, any other of the humanities at all. If I'm
It's
really
absolutely
strict, so
for new scientists, except when they start to impinge on our territory.
okay, so
This is what's going on.
if a historian comes in and sort of critiques, the really science or tries to deconstruct it, then you would start talking. Then you would.
So we often
that's
give them a
criteria.
platform in which to put their argument. But it has to be related to science, because that is our dominant worldview, and that's the kind of thing that our readers like. And I mean, it's very interesting to get reader responses sometimes. We ran a special issue about this kind of war on science, and in it, for balance, because we like balance, although we kind of feel we have to have balance in there. So we had Brian Appleyard write a piece about how scientists actually have brought this on themselves, and they need to understand what they've done. And basically, we got hundreds of letters in, most of which were criticising Brian Appleyard's viewpoint. And as a magazine, you pander to your readership in some respects, and our readership are furiously pro-science. And that comes through very clearly in letters that we get in. And of course, we have people of faith who read New Scientist and have a more balanced view, but they're not necessarily wanting to write in. But it's very interesting that even when we give space to what you might call the other side, the readers come in torrents and say these people's arguments are fatuous and blah blah blah. Whereas Robin Dunbar can come up with things like that, and people don't write in. So.
I think we've got time for one or two quick questions. Yes.
What about the role of values? There's kind of a feeling that, or there's an indication in some of what's been said that it's either science or that it is possible to have a discussion or write an article that's only about science, but most of what we do, we use value judgments. Certainly in science, there are scientists who say, oh no, it's all science and no value judgment, but everything we do pretty well, whether we apply for research money or the way we write a paper, we're using value judgments. So in your writing, in journalism, presumably you also use value judgments which are kind of edging towards faith.
Faith in science.
Well, belief structures other than hard evidence.
Oh yeah, I don't think anybody would. I mean, we know science isn't perfect for a start, so we choose to trust in it, trust in the process. And people have said that. I mean, Richard Dawkins has said the only faith you need as a scientist is faith that everyone is following the scientific process, which is questionable. The Korean stem cell crisis threw that into very stark light. And all of a sudden, we had to write about the failings of science and the fact that human beings are doing this and they're making, and we write all the time, in fact, about less than we used to about the pressures on scientists to get money from certain places and not others. There's all kinds of nuances that are there. And I don't think we're blind to them at all, and we do write about the failings of science, and and with kind of real hand wringing, because when it goes wrong, it shows how fallible it is. But I think that generally, we just kind of have this view that science is the best way, as there's kind of seeing the world, I guess. You have this worldview and you choose to live in it. Other people choose to live in a completely different worldview. But this is the worldview of science journalists and scientists.
Well, can I pick it, sorry, just to pick it up, the world of science and science journalism surely are two different things, aren't they? So you were wrapping those together as if they were one thing.
I think they're closer than they should be, to be honest. I think there is not scope for proper criticism or critiquing of science in science journalism, because we need the scientists on our side. This is the whole debate that we're having at the moment about whether we should let people approve. It's all very well to be set out as a crusading science journalist who's going to tell the truth about science, but you're probably going to end up blogging rather than getting paid for it.
One last question for Peter, and then we'll...
It's more of a comment
Yes,
on the previous bit, with why isn't there the other type of comment in science journalism. It's a commercial lump in the unit. When I buy cornflakes, I buy a box of cornflakes and I'd be a bit mystified if there's Mars bar in the room. And when I take a science journalist, someone like me, scientist, I don't expect to find the other comment, but I'll read it because I'll buy a different magazine to get that. So I buy my cornflakes, I buy my Mars bars, but I buy them when I want each one of them. And I dip into them when I would fancy a dip into each one of them. So I don't expect new scientists to start giving me anything else, otherwise I'm going to get confused.